money and relationships, like that is such a hot topic. And a lot, and we've all heard the statistic, right? Like of the marriages that end in divorce, like 50% of them are because of money fights or money issues. And I feel like a lot of it comes down to really two things in particular. One is just, of course, the lack of communication. But then I think a bigger issue there is a lack of shared values when it comes to money. Shireen, is that something you've noticed, like when you work with couples in therapy sessions, that if there's a lack of communication around the money or a lack of shared values?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think when it comes to relationships, I think conversations about money are just inherently emotionally loaded, because money represents a lot of things. It represents like security, freedom, control, trust, and even love. And so when couples talk about money, like they're really talking about values and their fears and or unmet needs, And so I think that if couples are just looking at it like face value of like, we're just talking about money, but they're struggling with these conversations, then I think that's when they have to take a step back and really look at like, oh, okay, what is really like beneath the surface here? What are we really talking about between the lines? Because when money gets talked about within a relationship, it's a conflict. It's rarely just about the money.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems that, when couples are having issues with the money, like most of the time it's like you said, because they aren't having shared values around how to deal with the money. And, we always tend to say like it doesn't necessarily matter. And there's a caveat there, of course, but it doesn't necessarily matter where you two are at financially. And that can be a hard pill to swallow for some people who have, done a lot to get ahead in their finances. But what matters more is are you two actually aligned in how you look at money? Because two people who are, let's say you're looking at two different couples, then they're both on wildly different bases with their finances than their partner. The couple who at least share the values, like, hey, one person might be really well off, the other person might be in debt, but they're like, no, I'm working towards getting out of this debt. It was from a part of me that, I want to get rid of, or a past life that I'm trying to move on from. Those two people are going to have so much more success than, say, another couple where they're both well off, but they look at money, they handle money, they do things with money differently. Like, have you noticed that?
Yes, absolutely. And what I've also really seen is it actually, I mean, the differences around money, it isn't always necessarily about how they're approaching money so differently, but what I see is how they're communicating to one another about the money. Like what tends to happen if one person has a very different view about money than the other is then what I've seen when there is a lot of conflict is one is really judgmental of the other, and then the other gets really defensive, and then the other, gets really hurt by that and starts avoiding having these conversations.
Yeah.
And we know that avoidance doesn't lead to anything good. And then, so there's this back and forth push and pull conflict that at the end of the day, it actually is no longer about the money. It's about how they're not feeling heard. They're not respecting one another. They're not acknowledging that they have different views and then coming together and saying, okay, as a couple, how can we address these differing views that we have? That's a very different conversation when two calm people are coming together saying, okay, I hear that you have this view. I have this one. How are we going to come together and try to make this work? Very different than being accusatory, being blaming the other. And that usually is what happens because money is a very hot emotional topic. And so the ways that people respond to those conversations, I think generally the way that they respond and communicate in those conversations is generally the biggest reason why sometimes those conversations go downhill.
Yeah. You were going to say something, Laura?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think probably what you could also trace this back to is how their parents communicated about money or didn't communicate about money. Did it create, when your parents talked about money, was it like super stressful and everybody just went to bed, nobody talked? Because then obviously when you're talking to your partner about it, you're going to obviously want to shy away from it because you know what that did to your parents. You know what I mean? Or, if someone, or then like maybe someone in the relationship is more of like managing the money and you just sort of feel like the child in the relationship. You know what I mean? So I think there's so many, I find this super fascinating to like trace all of that back and then how it comes into our current relationships. And then how do we change that moving forward? I think that's one of the biggest questions I have is like, yeah, that's ingrained in us for our entire childhood and, adolescence. And then it's like, and then we're supposed to be in a relationship together and combine finances and it just all be okay. So I don't know, there's a much bigger topic and probably a whole other episode to this, but that's just something that comes to mind whenever I think about couples and how they handle their money together.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think it goes even beyond to how they handle their money together. And it's more about how are they handling conflicts together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because if you know that, say you're coming in really defensive, but you in this relationship are open to, say, being gently called out, like say your partner said, hey, you're being a little defensive. Are you aware of that? And you're actually open to that and say, yeah, I am actually being a little defensive. And you're interested in being introspective and like be curious about, okay, why am I getting defensive? Why am I responding in this way? I don't want to respond in this way. I want to, and actually be very open in the conversation with your partner about wanting to make changes or wanting to get on the same page with each other instead of attacking one another. That makes a huge difference, right? Because the reality is with a couple, you're always going to have something that you're disagreeing about. Like there's always with most couples, there's usually at least one or two ongoing conflicts in a relationship that will just never get solved. And right? That's just the reality. And sometimes, you're lucky if it's just one or two. And so it ends up not really it's not about coming to a resolution in those conflicts. It's actually more about how are we going to coexist as a team with these conflicts so that the both of us can still feel like we're being heard and understood, in the context of, say, the money conversations. And so that's where I think things get really lost is like, yes, shared values is important. Like, do we want to save for X? How do we want our retirement to look like? How do we want to raise our children, private school, public, like those conversations are really important, right? But I think how the conversations are being had, I think will really determine the success and whether or not they'll actually figure stuff out. Because it actually speaks to a lot deeper issues if there are there within the relationship.
Yeah. At what point should or would someone draw the line if say them and their spouse are not on the same page with money? Like, because there's, of course, in a relationship, there's compromise and then there's standing your ground on what you think you feel is right. Like, where do people kind of draw that line if they feel like they're not in alignment with, and I guess, of course, it's going to be different if you are dating someone versus if you're married to someone. But where do people, like, how do they determine where they draw the line between misaligned values on money?
Yeah, I think that this is a good reason why it's just paramount to talk about this kind of stuff before getting married, right? To make sure that the really big stuff you guys are on the same page with, right? Like if you have one partner who is not interested in investing in retirement at all, yet you have another one who's like, absolutely, we have to. And you just, there's no room there's no wiggle room. There's no compromise on that. Or like one person says like, I have to, our kids have to go to the most expensive private schools. And the other person's like, absolutely not. Like those kinds of things have to be talked about ahead of time. And in terms of where you draw the line, I think obviously when you're on opposite ends of the spectrum and there's no room for compromise, like either one are not willing to compromise, then I think that does just bring up the question of, well, are we a good match? Are we a good match to be lifelong partners if we do view things very differently in that way, or if we value things differently? But this happens a lot, right? Like where you have one really frugal person and then you have another person who's a big spender, and I think like mutual consideration is key, like, okay, you could be a big spender, but if you know that actually is something that your partner gets really upset with, you keep doing it. That's a lack of consideration of your partner, right? And then that actually can create a whole other issue, right? It ends up actually not really being totally a money issue. It's actually, well, that this is something that's upsetting to me, yet you're still doing it. And that partner who's frugal is not going to feel good about that, right? Like that may be like, well, I feel like you're not really showing me love and consideration by continuing to spend excessively.
The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.